up, YouTube? It's Knowledge of Self-Determination. Back with you guys with more Black History every day. So today in history, February 19th, in 1919, the first Pan-African Congress held in Paris, France. Um, Now, what I believe when they say, I believe it's the first Pan-African conference that was held in Paris, France. Not that the very first Pan-African Congress was actually uh, not the actual first Pan-African conference, because I believe the actual very first Pan-African conference was held in London in 1900. But I'll update you guys on some of the information from the 1919 Pan-African Conference, which is what my resource is referring to for this day in history, and I will give you guys some information on the first Pan-African Conference that was held in London on a completely different date in July. So we're a little bit off from that. However, they're both relevant because it's, Pan-African Congress. Let's see. So I'll begin. One of the great contributions of W.E.B. Du Bois, born 1868, died 1963, to the growth of organized Pan-Africanism was the quote-unquote revival of the movement, which seemed moribund, as his Pan-African Congress convened in Paris in February 1919. Africanists and African nationalists who called Du Bois the quote-unquote father of organized Pan-Africanism trace his leadership back to 1919. But the evidence of the career of Du Bois shows that the concept had remained alive since the Pan-African Conference of 1900, called by the Trinidadian lawyer Henry Sylvester Williams, which Du Bois attended. In the course of the First World War, Du Bois believed that the changes and the idealism of the war offered an opportunity for blacks the world over to benefit from the ideals of democracy, anti-imperialism, and anti-colonialism, especially as expressed in the 14 points. And in a real sense, Du Bois had to be one of the early Pan-Africanists to restore the vibrant heartbeat of the movement. New leaders were not yet ready. Death had claimed the lives of Henry Sylvester Williams in 1911 and Dr. Edward W. Blyden, the leading Pan-Negro of the 19th century, 1912. In 1915, Bishop Henry M. Turner, Booker T. Washington, and Benito Sylvain died. Also later, Bishop James Johnson and Nigerian nationalist, and Bishop Alexander Walters, black Afro-American president of the Pan-African Association of 1900, died. So did Reverend Majola. So, just to give you guys some of the backstory for the 1919 Pan-African Conference, which I believe was necessary. I believe that something to that effect is necessary now because there's still colonialism going on in Africa. In fact, the people of Africa still are not free, for the most part, from the rule of outside forces. Like the Dutch, the British, Italians, even Asians now moving into Africa and profiting off of the natural resources of Africa and basically colonizing Africa for the most part. But for some reason, the world cannot seem to leave Africa alone. Leave Africa to the Africans. The people whose land that is should be in control of the resources, right? They should be in control of the resources so that Africa and the African countries can actually bring themselves up out of quote-unquote third world status, at least in some of the countries where that is the actual status of those countries. Why can't the world leave Africa alone? Which I believe is a very good question. Now I'll move on to the 1900 Pan-African Conference, which is the first one. The first Pan-African Conference was held in London from July 23rd to the July 25th, 1900, just prior to the Paris exhibition of 1900. Quote, in order to allow tourists of African descent to attend both events, end quote. I don't know whose quote that is, but in any event, I'll continue. Organized primarily by the Trinidadian barrister Henry Sylvester Williams, which we just read a little bit about. It took place in Westminster Hall and was attended by 37 delegates and about 10 other participants and observers from Africa, the West Indies, the U.S., and the U.K., including Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the youngest delegate, John Alcindor, Dadabahai Naroji, I believe I'm saying that right, probably not though, John Archer, Henry Francis Downing, and W.E.B. Du Bois, with Bishop Alexander Walters of the AME Zion Church taking the chair. Du Bois played a leading role, drafting a letter addressed to the nations of the world, to European leaders, appealing to them to struggle against racism, to grant colonies in Africa and the West Indies the right to self-govern, and demanding political and other rights for African Americans. So like I said, Africa needs to be free of colonial rule from any non-African and or non-black races of people. You need to be colonized. I mean, they need to be. They do not need to be in Africa, colonizing Africa, making their languages official languages of certain countries in Africa. Because there's no country in the world where African people can go and colonize certain sections of those countries and cities, call it their own, and start profiting and benefiting from the natural resources or whatever the gross national product is of that particular region of the world. There's nowhere in the world where Africans can do that. Nowhere. They don't even allow us to do it in places where we are the majority people. But I digress. A little bit of background. On September 24th, 1897, Henry Sylvester Williams had been instrumental in founding the African Association, not to be confused with the Association for Promoting the Discovery of the Interior Parts of Africa, in response to the European partition of Africa that followed the 1884-85 Congress of Berlin. The formation of the association marked an early stage in the development of the anti-colonialist movement and was established to encourage the unity of Africans and people of African descent, particularly in territories of the British Empire, concerning itself with injustices in Britain's African and Caribbean colonies. In March 1898, the association issued a circular calling for a Pan-African conference. Booker T. Washington, who had been traveling in the UK in the summer of 1899, wrote in a letter to African American newspapers, quote, "In connection with the assembling of so many Negroes in London from different parts of the world, a very important movement had just been put upon foot. It is known as the Pan-African Conference. Representatives from Africa and West Indian Islands and other parts of the world asked me to meet them a few days ago with a view to making a preliminary program for this conference, and we had a most interesting meeting. It is surprising to see the strong intellectual mold which many of these Africans and West Indians possess. The object and character of the Pan-African Conference is best told in the words of the resolution, which was adopted at the meeting referred to. In view of the widespread ignorance which is prevalent in England about the treatment of native races under European and American rule, the African Association, which consists of members of the race resident in England and which has been in existence for nearly 2 years, have resolved during the Paris Exposition of 1900, which many representatives of the race may be visiting, to hold a conference in London in the month of May of the said year, in order to take steps to influence public opinion on existing proceedings and conditions affecting the welfare of the natives in various parts of Africa, the West Indies, and the United States. The resolution is signed by Mr. H. Mason Joseph, President, and Mr. H. Sylvester Williams as Honorable Secretary. The Honorable Secretary will be pleased to hear from representative nations who are desirous of attending at an early date. He may be addressed, Common Room Grays in London, Common Room Grays in London, WC. I'm not sure what WC stands for. I'm not even going to guess. Some of the concerns that were going to be addressed during the conference. When the first Pan-African Conference opened on Monday, July 23rd, 1900, in London's Westminster Hall, Bishop Alexander Walters, in his opening address, quote, "The trials and tribulations of the colored race in America," end quote, noted that, quote, "For the first time in history, black people had gathered from all parts of the globe to discuss and improve the condition of their race, to assert their rights and organize so that they might take an equal place among nations," end quote. The Bishop of London, Mando Creighton, gave a speech of welcome, quote, referring to the benefits of self-government which Britain must confer on other races as soon as possible, end quote. Speakers over the 3 days addressed a variety of aspects of racial discrimination. Among the papers delivered were, quote, "Conditions favoring a high standard of African humanity," end quote. C.W. French of St. Kitts, quote, "The preservation of racial equality," end quote. Anna H. Jones from Kansas, quote, "The necessary concord to be established between native races and European colonists," end quote. Benito Sylvan, Haitian aide-de-camp to the Ethiopian emperor, quote, "The Negro problem in America," end quote. Anna J. Cooper from Washington, quote unquote, "The progress of our people." John E. Quinlan of St. Lucia, and quote unquote, "Africa, the Sphinx of history in the light of unsolved problems." D.E. Tobias from the USA. Other topics included Richard Phipps' complaint of discrimination against black people in the Trinidadian civil service, and an attack by William Mayer, a medical student at Edinburgh University, on pseudoscientific racism. Discussions followed the presentation of the papers, and on the last day, James Christian, a law student from Dominica, led a discussion on the subject, quote, "Organized plunder and human progress had made our race their battlefield," end quote, saying that in the past, quote, "Africans had been kidnapped from their land, and in South Africa and Rhodesia, slavery was being revived in the form of forced labor," end quote, which we still see by and large today. Forced labor, Africans forced to dig in these natural mineral mines, like these the precious gems, rubies, diamonds, gold, and platinum, and things of that nature. These people are forced to do this. They're hollowing out the ground in Africa, digging up these raw minerals, these precious gems, because of European rule. The Oppenheimers and De Beers have little children, basically working as slaves for the most part, and they are not benefiting from the actual profits that these people, these fantastically wealthy people make. They make tons of money off of Africa, and Africa doesn't see a dime of the money that they spend, or rather make, off of Africa. So I'll continue. The conference culminated in the Conversation of the African Association, formed by Sylvester Williams in 1897, into the Pan-African Association, and the implementation of a unanimously adopted, quote-unquote, address to the nations of the world, sent to various heads of state where people of African descent were living and suffering oppression. The address implored the United States and the imperial European nations to, quote, "acknowledge and protect the rights of people of African descent," end quote, and to respect the integrity and independence of, quote, "the free Negro states of Abyssinia, Liberia, Haiti, etc.," end quote. Signed by Walters, president of the Pan-African Association, the Canadian Reverend Henry B. Brown, vice president, Williams, general secretary, and Du Bois, chairman of the committee on the address. The document contained the phrase, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," end quote, which Du Bois would use 3 years later in the quote-unquote forethought of his book, The Souls of Black Folks, which I am actually just about done reading. In September, the delegates petitioned Queen Victoria through the British government to look into the treatment of Africans in South Africa and Rhodesia, including specific acts of injustice perpetrated by whites there, namely, 1. The degrading and illegal compound system of labor labor in vogue in Kimberley and Rhodesia. 2. The so-called indentured, i.e. legalized bondage of African men, women, and children to white colonists. 3. The system of compulsory labor in public works. 4. The pass or docket system used for people of color. 5. Local bylaws tending to segregate and degrade Africans, such as the curfew, the denial to Africans to use the footpaths, and the use of separate public conveyances. 6. Difficulties in acquiring real property. 7. Difficulties in obtaining the franchise. The response eventually received by Sylvester Williams on January 17, 1901 stated, quote, "Sir, I am directed by Mr. Secretary Chamberlain to state that he has received the Queen's commands to inform you that the memorial of the Pan-African Conference requesting the situation of the native races in South Africa has been laid before Her Majesty, and that she was graciously pleased to command him to return an answer to it on behalf of her government." 2. I don't know where number 1 is, but anyway, I'll continue reading. Mr. Chamberlain accordingly desires to assure the members of the Pan-African Conference that it's settling the lines on which the administration of the conquered territories is to be conducted, Her Majesty's government will not overlook the interests and welfare of the native races. Days later, Victoria responded more personally, instructing her private secretary, Arthur Bigg, to write, which he did on January 21st, the day before the Queen died. Although the specific injustices in South Africa continued for some time, the conference brought them to the attention of the world. So, just wanted to give you guys a little bit of history on this day in history about the first Pan-African Conference held in 1900 and the one that was the first Pan-African Conference of 1919 held in Paris, France. Now, although W.E.B. Du Bois did have issues with Booker T. Washington and the way he went about his work and his vision for black people and what he thought would be best suited for black people to try and do in order to basically, I guess, gain respect and some sense of freedom in America. They differed on certain issues. However, when it came to their visions on Pan-Africanism, as you can see, they both attended the first Pan-African Conference or were involved in it in some manner, way, shape, or form. And this is a discussion that shouldn't end because there was a Pan-African Conference last year in 2016. There have been plenty of Pan-African conferences, but the question is, what are we actually gaining from them? Because we can have conferences all we want, but is the world actually listening to what we're saying? I think they hear us. I think they're listening. I just don't think they care. So the question remains, what are we going to do about the constant disrespect that we receive all over the world? When are the places where we are the predominant force or the predominant people going to be turned over to us so that we can profit the way other races profit off of our labor, which seems to be one of the guiding forces to European and or non-white wealth and privilege, them gaining riches and wealth and power off of the backs of Black, African, and or other non-white people. Again, nothing that I say in these videos is to throw shade or hatred towards white people. It's merely done to shed light on an ongoing situation. If you can't see that this is a problem for people of color across the world, then you're probably a part of the problem itself. This is Knowledge of Self-Determination. I'll be back again tomorrow with more Black history every day. Like, learn, and subscribe, and I'm out. Peace.